In all his time on the High Council of the Intergalactic Congress Ion, acting as a representative of the Lepidopteran trade and embargo on planet Lepero in the Parimark system, Representative Metamo had seen many, many things. Thanks to his species' natural hive-mind link, he had access to generations of information and memories housed in the core of every Lepidopteran and their home planet, which, for all purposes, was alive. Lepidopterans looked strikingly similar to moths but were the size of any xenospecies, usually standing at 5 feet 4 inches with a wingspan of 12 feet when fully spread out. Their wings granted them flight but could be folded in on themselves when needed. They were usually white in color, but grays and blacks did exist. Through a special pigment in their scales, they could change color at will or when high emotions were felt. They had 2 limbs for walking and 4 for grabbing, with 2 antennae for sensing their environment, such as changes in temperature, weather, wind speed, and radiation. 2 large compound eyes sat in their heads, and they could see almost 360 degrees. Even still, never had he ever seen something so astonishing, and to be honest, neither had any of his other fellow representatives and delegate. What had initially started as a normal meeting between several systems to make typical decisions regarding trading various goods quickly turned into an eye-opening experience for everyone on the Intergalactic Congression's main space station, Epsilon 9. The meeting that was being held was set to start at approximately 5200 hours, Margath system time, the current location of Epsilon 9, but one attended was absent. Under normal circumstances, the discussions would start without them. Still, this tardy individual was made to be an exception since the delegate was from a Deathworld, more specifically, Terra Prime, or as they call it, Earth. Ask anyone anything about Deathworlders, and they'll tell you the same thing that everyone else knows, but for humans, it's much, much different. Everyone had a different story or theory or something else about how terrifying these things are. Sure, they are intelligent and more than happy to sit down and discuss a situation rather than go into full-scale combat over nothing. Still, it didn't detract from what everyone knew about what they could, and would absolutely do. So, for the sake of not insulting the Terrian, they decide to wait. After all, only a few minutes had passed. They could wait that long for him to arrive. And luckily for the room's rising nerves, he did arrive only 3 minutes late. Unfortunately, the thing that got everyone's attention and pure silence was the fact that the Terrian was being carried on one of the shoulders of another Deathworlder species. More specifically, an Unga of Ugathara in the Hallowed system. They were the Council's newer addition to the Intergalactic Congress Ion and one that they were begging to regret inviting. While they were socially and mentally intelligent enough to join without being classified as savages, they sure did everything to act like it. Once the Council invited them, they wanted to do nothing but find something new to fight. Apparently, their home world is in a constant state of civil war between dozens of tribes, up to the point that they live and look forward to combat. While this trait of theirs did help in the short term, fighting against other less savory xenospecies such as the Kuzar reptilia, the fungals of Endothermo, and the silent menace of the Conkers, it became a problem when they would fight other spacefaring species who were either very scared, confused, or misinformed. The Council, High Council, and even the Intergalactic Congress Ion wanted to oust them but also didn't want to risk a war with such a violent-oriented xenospecies. They are, how do the Terrains say it? Neanderthals that were given a gun. Whatever a Neanderthal is, the saying fits well. And here was one now, carrying the other highly unpredictable Deathworlder on one shoulder like they were friends or something. It could be due to the fact that these two species resembled one another. The Unga were 8-foot-tall hairy beats with rippling muscles, clawed hands, large incisors, and disproportionate arms. Dark hair covered every inch of their bodies apart from the hands, feet, and face, with yellow eyes poking out and a manner of fur around the neck and back that made them look even more imposing and large. From the way humans describe themselves as violent monkeys, it would make sense for them to gravitate. In addition, Metamo heard that humans view them like the mythical Yetis and Sasquatch from Terra Prime, so that would also be a reason. Maybe the Unga see humans as smaller pink versions of their babies? Terrians and Unga had similar lifespans, but the Unga matured at a faster rate. While Terrian children matured around the age of 18-20, Unga children matured around the age of 10-12. Whatever the case may be, what was currently happening was actually happening. The Terrian and Unga were just about as different as one could imagine, not only in their biology but also in their appearances. The Terrian, known as Delagt Rick Chroma of Terra Prime, was wearing a white suit with every fixing imaginable to make himself as prim and proper as any other delegate. The Unga, whose name no one knew, was just as dirty and smelly as the rest of his kind and wearing a loincloth skirt of different animal pelts, no doubt from his homeworld that he killed with nothing but his bare hands and a sharp rock, and decorated with teeth of the same creatures. As the Unga walked the Terrian over to his seat in the small amphitheater, Rick spoke his apology, saying, "Ladies, gentlemen, those of you who can't or don't classify into those two categories. I am so sorry for my lateness. My wheelchair had accidentally gone through a gelatorn, which ate some rincane mimi berries, and his gelatinous pH went all the way up to acidic. And my bionic legs are still in repair after they short-circuited and caused me to run through 3 sheets of drywall," he said with a displeased expression, saying with a shiver and a whip of his tongue, "Bleck. I can still taste it." After recomposing himself, Rick told the council as the Unga helped him into his assigned seat, "Now then, regarding the issues you've been having over the past several weeks, I'd like to propose that blah 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 blah." That was as far as Metamo was able to keep his focus before his mind wandered into question after question while staring at the Unga standing behind the human, trying to mediate between whatever was currently being discussed. Its yellow eyes are hard and focused as it looks in front and never wavering, with long arms crossed over its chest. And from what his compound eye could see, the many other delegates were also very distracted by the sight. The meeting flew by faster than any other before in the history of Metamo's attendance on the council or high council, as the mostly distracted delegates seemingly agreed to all of Rix's proposals. When the meeting ended with whatever changes were made under their noses or lack of any, the Unga carefully took the Terrian upon his shoulder and began to walk him out. At that moment, Metamo finally snapped out of his stupor and worked up the nerve to confront the two of them despite every inch of his hive mind telling him not to. Spreading his wings, he quickly flew after the two into the hallway despite it being considered rude and, in his haste, cut them off, making the Unga growl a threat at him. Once he landed, he refolded his wings and quickly said through the universal translator clipped like a badge to his fluffy fur collar, "Terra Prime Delegate Rick, may I bother you for a bit of your time?" Rick shook his head, petting the Unga to calm himself as he replied, "Not at all, Delegate Metamo of Leo Leopard." Rick tried and failed to pronounce the planet's name. "Lepero is my home world, Lepidopteran is what my species is referred to." Metamo helped him. Rick slapped his head and said apologetically, right, my bad. I'm not good with words, action has always been my strong suit. It is quite alright, not many get it correct the first time around. Even in my native tongue, it's pronounced much differently," Metamo assured him. "So, what did you want to ask?" Rick inquired, crossing his hands. Trying to find the words not to offend either of them, Metamo eventually asked while truing a queasy shade of green, "I was hoping I could ask about the arrangement between you and your friend here." "Well, I'm sure glad someone finally asked," Rick said with an elated tone. Shocked, confused, and surprised by this, Metamo asked as his colors flushed from red to yellow, "Your Glade?" I asked. "Yes. I was hoping someone would so I could clear the air and not get even more weird stares than I get on a daily basis," Rick said with relief, whipping his head back and sighing. "I'm glad I can help. I think," Metamo said in an unsure tone, turning a shade of blue and indigo. "Do you mind if we take this somewhere more comfortable? As much as Balzer could hold me on his shoulder all day, and he can too, I'd like not to do that if possible," Rick asked as he petted the Unga's head again, who smiled proudly at the praise. "Of course, please, after you, Belazer," Metamo offered while stepping out of the way, making Balzer snicker at his timidness and shade of yellow. Belazer then walked over to one of the many open lounging areas on the spacecraft. Not only does it keep anyone from doing things behind closed doors in a casual setting, but it also allows anyone to access it from any side, escape when needed, or keep watch over those who are less than savory, such as the two Deathworlders. Belazer placed Rick onto one of the automatic physiology adjusting couches and adjusted his unmoving legs as Mitamo sat in one across from the human. At the same time, Belazer stood behind Rick like a guard dog. Once they were settled and more comfortable, Mitamo began, "So, how did you two come to be so amiable with one another?" "Ah. Well, that's quite the story. Well, the footnotes are, he's my son." Rick explained this in short, making Mitamo tense up with shock and questions as his wings nearly popped out. Rick saw this and assured him, calm down. He's not a crossbreed like the Mero Lin, he's a full-blooded Unga. I adopted him." Rick further explained. "Adopted?" Mitamo questions. "Yes. Do you remember when the Irath and Ake had that deal made way back when, and we ended up discovering the Conkers?" Rick asked him. "I do." Mitamo answered with a head nod. "Well, that opened a whole rabbit hole of things to come. We saved several planets and other xenospecies from the Conquerors and fought them a few times. Until our game of cat and mouse led us to Ugathara, where we had to give aid." Rick continues to tell his tale. Mitamo looked at the Unga with surprise and said, baffled by the terrain, "Aid? To them? They couldn't handle the Conkers? I find it hard to believe knowing what I know." Only for Balzer to growl at him, taking it as the many insults Head here whispered about him. Rick put a hand on his hairy leg, calming him down as he told the moth alien, "Well, the Conkers stopped trying the long con and decided a full-scale invasion. Unfortunately for Ugathara, they just had another of their planetary tribal wars, which knocked out 40% of the population, and they are trying to get back on their feet." 40%? Mitamo said in shock, his color changing to indigo. From there, Rick surmises the rest of his story in a short rant, explaining in full, "Yep, and the Conkers took full advantage of it. I will spare you the gruesome detail before divulging into a hysterical PTSD crying fit, but during the last leg of the war, my platoon and I had been separated or killed by the Conkers with only me left to defend a small camp. That's where I met a baby Belazer and his mother. Long story short, I came to her defense as she was trying to defend her baby. I took a plasma shot to my spine and became crippled. Just before the Conkers could take me out, Belazer's mother managed to hide him away. She came to my rescue, tearing apart the last of the Conkers." Rick then paused as he shuddered violently, making Mitamo tense up and flare a warning color of orange. "I'll admit, it was the most amazing and horrifying sight I've ever seen. I never knew that any alien could be colored sliver from their skin and blood to their bones and organs. From there, I fell into her good graces, and since her husband had died, I decided to act as a father to Belazer and raised him as if he were my own." Rick finished off. "That's beautiful," Mitamo said while rubbing some of his compound eyes. He realized what he had said and looked over to see Belazer glaring at him. He quickly backtracked and said, "Not the war and you losing your legs part." "It's okay, Mitamo, I understand nuances," Rick assured him with a hand wave. "Was that all you wanted to ask?" Rick inquired. "Well, yes, I guess. I just never expected any race, let alone Terrians, to be able to quell the Unga's thirst for battle," Mitamo admitted. Belazer finally reacted to this and began to grunt at him in his native tongue angrily. The speech of the Unga wasn't like regal words but more like hideous grunts, growls, and roars. Also, unfortunately, he couldn't make heads or tails of his speech since the Unga language had yet to be recorded by the universal translator. Making Mitamo sink into his chair in fear and flash a hue of fearful colors as a way to ward him off, but to no avail. Even everyone around the area and walking through the many inner lacing hallways fled in terror at what sounded like an attack about to happen. But before the poor moth's heart could give out, Rick performed another spectacle almost equally amazing as coming to a meeting on another Deathworlder's shoulder. He began to speak in Unga's native language. Slapping his son's leg to get his attention, he began to yell back at him with the same grunting sounds. Balzer argued back at him, only for Rick to raise his voice and wave his finger, finally making Balzer back off. Mitamo looked on in shock and could only babble out, "You speak his language?" I picked it up while raising him. Somehow, My inability to properly pronounce certain words allows me to speak Ungarian fluently. Rick tells him with a small chuckle, leaving the moth to sit there completely gobsmacked. What were we talking about again? Rick asked. How did you quell his penchant for battle? Mitamo answered mindlessly. It's not about quelling, Rick said with a laugh as Mitamo flashed a confused violet. It's about redirecting. You have to know how to use their aggression for other things, like building or demolition. The Unga were very useful in warfare, right? You just have to tell them what they can and can't fight. Speak for yourself, Mitamo told him while rolling a few compound eyes and nervously glancing at Belazer. I know you might think it difficult, what with them being so intimidating, but I can assure you they are willing to compromise on certain things. If they didn't, they would have wiped themselves out ages ago. Rick assured him, but the moth still didn't look all too convinced. If you're still not satisfied, how about you wait with me to meet someone who might change your mind? Rick offered. Mitamo flashed more confused violet and wondered who he meant. His curiosities as of now had been quelled, and he knew he had to get back to the council to see what they had agreed on, but something in the back of his mind, his own mind and not the hive, told him to stay. After all, he didn't have much work to do that day. Luckily, he didn't have to wait long for this mysterious visitor to arrive, but in his distraction, he didn't notice their arrival since they came from the one blind spot he had on his whole body. Hello grandfather, hello father, said a voice from behind him, making Mitamo jump and flash a warning orange. Mitamo jumped off his seat and spun around to see another Unga who looked like Belazer but somewhat younger. Then again, to him, all Unga looked the same. But this one was so different from Belazer. Sure, he was big, muscular, and shaggy. But his manner was groomed and braided in several parts. He smelled clean. He was wearing a suit similar to Rick's but without any shoes. He also stood up straight with hands behind his back, unlike Belazer, who was slightly hunched over. Seeing the new Unga, Belazer's expression of irritation and aggression morphed into pure joy as he spoke the Unga language in a much slower and less growly tone, actually sounding like words and not noise. Even Rick was overjoyed at seeing the other Unga saying something in the strange language. Belazer moved to the younger Unga and wrapped him in a hug while lifting him off his feet. Once he was put back on his feet, Belazer began to reprimand the youngster as Rick reached and slapped the back of his leg, reprimanding Belazer back, leading the two to get into a heated argument, or maybe it was a regular argument. It was hard to tell when your language was composed of words that sounded like animalistic grunts and roars. As the two bickered, the younger Unga stood off to the side next to Mitamo, where the moth alien barely looked over to the much more well-groomed and mannered Unga, where he asked, I'm sorry. May I have some context, please? Without looking over and down at him, the youngster translated for him, my apologies. My grandfather was greeting me, and my father was yelling at me for not using our native language despite my grandfather going out of his way to do so, knowing full well that humans usually don't want or can't speak our language. And my grandfather was yelling at him to lay off me. Play your cards right, and you may just get a seat, but from what I see, you already have the makings of a member. Mitamo assured the youngster with a wink, though it couldn't be seen. Alador smiled with all his teeth and nearly pounced on the moth as he grabbed two of his forearms and shook them rapidly enough to shake his whole body off the ground, practically yelling in excitement, "Thank you for your kind words, Delegate Mitamo," only to realize what he was doing and gently let him down. After nearly being shaken to death and almost losing his two favorite arms, Mitamo managed to get a hold of himself. He coughed up his fear and said, "You're most welcome, future Delegate Alador." After getting all his compound eyes refocused from the shaking, Mitamo inquired, "If you don't mind, could I pick your brain?" "Of course." Alador agreed. "Your father, Belazer. Does he?" Mitamo began to ask until Alador figured out his question and cut him off. "My father used to have a lot of siblings, but they all died, whether in the tribal war or from the conquers. He was the last child my grandmother ever had or could have," he said. "I'm sorry?" Metamo prompted further. "Did my grandfather already tell you of how they met?" Alador asked as Metamo nodded. "Well, my grandmother wasn't too lucky, you see. She got shot several times, and a few hit her reproductive organs. So, she was unable to bear children. Something that is looked down upon in my culture. My grandfather basically took her and my father back to Earth with him to keep her from being shunned. Then, when my father was old enough, he went back to Ugathara to stake his claim and some mates. It's kinda what we do, he said with a casual shrug. Then how did you? Metamo began to ask while motioning to Alador. I was raised partially on Ugathara and Terra Prime. You can see which part of my upbringing I took more to. Alador once again cut him off in explanation. I see. Matamo said, thinking. Only for another question to come to mind as he inquired, and your grandfather and grandmother never? Alador made an amused face as he laughed. Oh no, never. Their love is strictly platonic. Besides, my grandma is 30 years his senior. Matamo considered all this new information, allowing it to seep into the hive mind, before asking, in a more careful tone, I'm sorry if it's rude, but do your people eat babies? We do, but not in the way you think. If a baby dies, whether at birth or before reaching the first year of life, our people's customs dictate that we eat them so that their unused strength can be given to the rest of the tribe. Alador explained. That's interesting. What happens if someone kills an infant by accident or purpose? Metamo follows up. This time, Alador thinks for a minute before he explains. If proven by accident, that individual helps raise the other children of the parents. If done on purpose, we kill them, but that's me sugar-coating it. Babies and children are held in high importance. He told him while raising a finger as if to drive the point further. I see. Metamo said this while absorbing all this new information and correcting all his previous misgivings about the Unga. Only for his brewing session to be cut short when Alador suddenly exclaimed, Oh, here come my grandma and fiancé. Hearing him say this, Belazer and Rick stopped their argument and turned to see two more Unga coming to them, two females, to be precise, who were much like Alador and Belazer in how they presented themselves. The first one was a much older female in a wheelchair, small and shriveled. Her coat was now grey and white, with wrinkles so deep that they appeared to blind her. No muscles were on her body as she slapped her lips together with a nearly toothless mouth. She wore simple clothing like Belazer, a toga of some kind made of animal pelts and decorated with teeth. The other female was younger, still strong, and full of color and youth as she pushed the older female's wheelchair. She was well groomed and smelled nice, like Alador. She even wore a terrain female formal wear suit and pencil skirt with no shoes. Even more surprising was the lick stick on her lips, being the only makeup to decorate her face. As they approached, Belazer came up and hugged the younger female with just as much strength as he had given his son before going to the younger female and leaning down to hug and let her kiss him. She even used her hands to feel his face, showing she was either blind or couldn't see very well. The younger female came up to Alador, and the two shared a short but romantic kiss. From there, Alador went to the older female and let her kiss him and feel his face. As this went down, they were all using the Unga language to speak to one another. Eventually, Rick got sick of being left out and yelled for the rest to come closer. When they did, Rick leaned up to hug the younger female as she leaned down. Upon hearing his voice, the older female, who was very slow and repressed, became much more lively as she reached out her arms to find him. Rick took her hands in his and began to speak, what Metamo assumed were sweet nothings, making the older females smile. As the human and old Unga spoke to one another, Miatamo's curiosity got the better of him, and he inquired of Alador, Can I ask what your grandfather and mother are saying? My grandfather compliments my grandmother, tells her how good she looks, and so forth. My grandmother is acting all giddy over the compliments. Alador translates for him as the old Unga begins to laugh and giggle like a schoolgirl. My grandfather is now asking her how the trip was and how she's doing on the space station, and my grandmother is going over a list of complaints. The food, the ride, the overuse of AC, and the noise from other passengers. She also says that even though her body hurts a lot less in the reduced gravity of the station, she knows it's gonna bite her back once she gets to the gravity she's used to. He translates as she watches the older female's expression become much more displeased. Only to watch Rick pull a phone from his pocket, dial a number, and speak unhair to the person on the other end. Where Alado told him, "And my grandfather is calling one of my mothers to get some painkillers ready for her." As Metamo watched this whole exchange, he couldn't help but stare at the elderly female. Despite once being a member of a race of mighty beasts, she was now a shell of her former self. Weak, blind, toothless, and completely unable to walk or eat without assistance. At least Rick was still young for his species and could still do many things with a bit more effort involved. But why keep her alive? What purpose did she serve? I don't see why they don't get rid of the elderly one. My people's only use for the old is to feed the grubs. Meatmo said without thinking, his translator picking up and spitting them out without hesitation. All the chatter stopped as all eyes fell on him, and he said in fear, "Did I say that out loud?" Unfortunately, it was Belazer who acted first and most aggressively, roaring at him in his native language. If he didn't give the Unger a good reason to tear him apart, he gave it to him now. He could try to fly away, but he knew that with the reduced gravity of the space station to conform to the homeworld of over 100 different species, Belazer was much faster. And nowhere was high enough for him to really get far enough out of reach. No weapon on the station could harm him, either. An Unger was once used as a test dummy for new weapon development. Everything bounced off him. Metamo knew he was done, so he closed his eyes and waited for a quick end. Luckily, he never got to feel the cold sting of death as Alador, his fiancée, and Rick came to his rescue to hold him back. This task was far easier said than done. Even with added weight on his shoulders and 2 fully grown Unger, Belazer still pushed with so much strength that it looked like light work for him. Luckily, Rick, who grabbed his son's fur and crawled up his back before slumping himself over his shoulder, grabbed his ear and began to yell something into it. This got Belazer's attention, and he stopped his pursuit of the moth. As he argued with his father again, Belazer walked off to argue with his father elsewhere, only looking back to growl at Meatmo, who fell to the ground while clutching his chest. Seeing the crisis averted, Alador sighed in relief before turning to the moth and telling him in a firm warning tone, "Delegate Meatmo, in the future, I urge you not to speak ill of the elderly. Next time, my grandfather will not be there to save you. My apologies." Metamo apologized while swallowing his heart back into his chest. After calming down a bit, Metamo eventually asked Alador, "What did your grandfather say to your father, convincing him not to tear me to shreds?" "Well, that's one of the things he screamed at doing to you. But he basically told him not to bother fighting something so weak as it would bring shame and that you were nothing but an uncultured idiot." Alador told him. "I would fervently disagree with that, but I know him in no place to do so." Metamo said as Alador gave him an "you think?" expression. Alador sighed while brushing his suit off and then told the moth, "I understand you and many other species see the elderly as useless, but like our children, the elderly are held in the highest regard of our tribes and hold the highest post of our hierarchy. Acting as tribal leaders, shamans, soothsayers, and generals. Beware of the old man in a profession where men die young. As the old terrain adage goes." Seeing that Belazer's previous anger had settled and he was now comforting his aged mother, Meatmo said, "I apologize. I forgot myself for a moment. I swear these translators can pick up on what I think. Doesn't your species communicate mostly through telepathic speech?" Alador asked. Meatmo realized this and could only say, "Shoot. Aladar, come here, boy. I still haven't gotten my hug from you." Rick suddenly called over his grandson, who sighed like an exasperated teenager as he begrudgingly walked over to his grandfather, pulled him off his father's body, and wrapped him in a hug. From there, he placed this grandfather back on the couch, where the human asked, "Now, how are things between you and Malika?" Malika rolled her eyes in the background, and Alador resisted the urge to moan in complaint. He told him, "They're fine, we're engaged, and please don't ask us for children at this point." Rick looked insulted by his words and complained back, "Is it too much for a grandfather to want to see his great-grandchildren? Your father's second wife was pregnant with her third baby when he was your age. Come one, while I'm young. You only 49. Calm down, you're old but not that old. Alador sassed his grandfather. Well, at least do it for your grandmother. She has only 10% vision in her right eye. I want her to see the silhouette of her great-grandchild at least. Rick argued back as Alador slapped his face in frustration. Malika stepped in this time between the two and assured the man, "It'll happen soon, Ubar. She is still in good health." I.e. Ubar Unga word of high respect for an older individual or family member. "God, I hope you're right," Rick said with a stressed tone while blowing air from between his lips. Then, the elderly Unga said something to Rick, and he laughed, "Oh, trust me. I know you could still snap my femur with one hand." This made both of them laugh, leading Meatmo to look on in concern and fear. But before anything else could happen at that moment, a service droid hovered into the lounging area. It looked like someone put a robot head on spider legs with one red eye and made of chrome. In its spider-like legs, it held what looked like mechanical legs or a metal frame with wire-thin parts, one with clip-on straps. Its single red glass eye looked around the area and asked, "Representative Rick Cromer of Terra Prime." "Oh, that's me," Rick called out as the robot floated to his eye level. "Your bionic legs have been recalibrated to full standards. On behalf of the Ausian Replacement Limb Company, we are sorry for the error and harm to your person. Your total credits due have been wiped for this mistake," the robot told him while handing off the bionic legs. With that, the robot left, and Rick excitedly began to shimmy himself into the legs. With a bit of help from his son, he managed to get them on and have all the straps tightened down. From there, he lifted his shirt and revealed what looked like a small electrical port on the small part of his back. Taking a plunge from the mechanical legs, he hooked it into the port, and the legs began to glow with a soft white light. Rick made a strange noise as everything connected, and he complained, "Oh, I'll never get used to that feeling." Once everything was set, Rick took his son's hand and lifted it onto his feet, where he stood up on them, lifted each leg, stretched them out, and said with relief, "Ah, much better." After walking around a bit, Rick turned to the moth alien and told him, "Well, Delegate Mitamo, it's been an experience. Have a nice day, and sorry about my son's outburst. He tends to get overprotective. I'm sorry for my rude remark. See you at the next meeting. Hopefully, the Gelatorn will remove Rincane Mimi berries from their diet." Metamo jokingly replied, making Rick burst out laughing as he and his family went off to some other part of the space station. Metamo watched them until they disappeared from sight. From here, he had no idea what to do as his mind raced with so many thoughts. He could go back to the meeting hall and discuss what they all had agreed on. Or he could tell the High Council of his findings. Or he could connect to the hive mind of his homeworld and relay all this new information he had just learned. But for right now, the only thing he knew for sure was that the universe was a wide and strange place with many strange species and even more strange sights and events. He always thought that through his hive mind, from countless generations of individuals like him, he would always know what was what and accept it as fact. But he supposed that even so many minds could be wrong about times. The only problem was never learning from change and accepting they were wrong. And today, Meatmo was wrong about many things. Maybe Deathworlders aren't so bad after all.